It was the spring of 1944, and the skies over Europe were a graveyard. The 17 bombers, flying fortresses they were called, lumbered across German airspace in massive formations, thousands of feet above the ground, their silver skins glinting in the cold sunlight. Each mission meant a gauntlet of flak bursts, fighter attacks, and death. The Luftwaffe still ruled the air when the American bombers came too deep into enemy territory. Escort fighters tried to protect them, but the problem was always the same: range. No American fighter could make it all the way to Berlin and back. They would turn around, leaving the bombers to fend for themselves in the final and deadliest stretch. The losses were catastrophic. Entire bomber groups vanished in minutes, leaving behind only smoke trails and parachutes. The men flying those missions knew they were gambling with fate every time they took off. The phrase "a one-way ticket" started to spread through the airfields of England. Something had to change, and fast. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, a miracle arrived. A sleek, powerful aircraft, painted in olive drab and shark-like in profile, started showing up at airfields. The North American P-51 Mustang. It didn't look like much compared to the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt or the compact Spitfire. But soon, pilots began whispering about it. They said it could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything they'd seen before. It was the plane that could finally escort bombers deep into the Reich and bring its pilots home. But even a Mustang, as good as it was, wasn't enough. Not yet. There was still one missing piece. And when that missing piece finally clicked into place, it changed the air war forever. It wasn't a new weapon or a secret radar system. It wasn't even a new aircraft design. It was something so simple, so overlooked, that even seasoned pilots couldn't believe how much difference it made. The secret? Fuel. Specifically, 150-octane fuel. To understand how one small change in octane rating could tilt the entire balance of the war, we have to go back a few years before the Mustang ruled the skies, before American bombers blackened the horizon, to the early, desperate days of the Second World War. In 1940, as Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, the Royal Air Force was running on fumes, literally. The RAF's Hurricanes and Spitfires were good aircraft, but their engines were pushed to their limits on the fuel they had. British fuel averaged around 87 to 100 octane, and while that was decent, the German Luftwaffe had engines that could produce similar power on less. Britain needed an edge, something that could give their pilots just a little more horsepower, a little more climb rate, a little more speed. That edge came from across the Atlantic. In a quiet collaboration between British engineers and American fuel chemists, something revolutionary was developed: high-octane aviation gasoline. It was purer, more stable, and capable of withstanding higher compression pressures inside an engine. The higher the octane, the more power could be extracted from the same machine. When the first batches of 100-octane fuel arrived in Britain, produced by American oil companies like Shell and Standard Oil, it was poured into Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Blenheims. The results were immediate and dramatic. Engines that previously delivered 1,000 horsepower suddenly gave 1,300. Acceleration improved. Climb rate soared. The aircraft could dive faster, chase longer, and fight harder. During the Battle of Britain, this invisible advantage, fuel, was one of the key reasons the RAF could keep up with the Luftwaffe. German pilots were baffled by the sudden boost in British performance. They didn't know that the secret lay not in the planes, but in what filled their tanks. Fast forward to 1943. The Americans now had hundreds of bombers in the skies over Europe, but escort fighters still couldn't make the full journey. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast. It could take damage like a tank, but it guzzled fuel. The P-38 Lightning had the range, but struggled at high altitude over Europe's cold skies. Then came the P-51 Mustang, designed originally for the British. When fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it became something else entirely, a machine that combined speed, range, and agility in perfect balance. It could escort bombers deep into Germany, fight Messerschmitts head-to-head, and still make it home. But here's where it gets interesting. Even the Mustang had a ceiling. The Merlin engine could only do so much with the fuel available. And as missions went deeper and dogfights became more intense, engineers pushed for more power. That's when Allied fuel chemists, working secretly with oil companies, began experimenting again. This time, not with 100 octane, but with 150 octane. This new fuel blend was exotic, volatile, and expensive to produce. It used additives like tryptane and toluene, and it was so potent that it required careful handling and new maintenance procedures. But when poured into a Merlin engine, everything changed. Suddenly, a Mustang that previously produced around 1,500 horsepower could now unleash nearly 1,800. Boost pressure went up. Climb rates skyrocketed. The first time pilots used a new fuel in combat, the Luftwaffe didn't know what hit them. But that moment, we'll get to soon. Because the story of the day, 150 octane, fuel changed everything, isn't just about chemistry or engineering. It's about timing, bravery, and the invisible arms race happening inside every piston engine of the war. In the next part, we'll go inside the hangars and airfields where the change began. We'll hear from pilots who first tested this explosive new fuel, and how, overnight, it turned their Mustangs from great fighters into unstoppable hunters. And we'll see how that one invisible upgrade, just a few numbers on an octane chart, helped decide the fate of Europe's skies. The morning fog still hung over the airfield when ground crews began rolling out barrels marked with a strange red stencil, 150 OCT. Few of the men on the flight line knew what it meant. They'd seen 100 octane fuel before, standard issue for all fighters. But this was something new. The mechanics had been given strict instructions. Handle with care. Don't smoke near it. Don't mix it with the regular stuff. It was volatile, powerful, and unlike anything they'd ever poured into an aircraft before. At first, the pilots were skeptical. They had no reason to believe a change in fuel could make that much difference. A few even joked that it was just another high-command experiment. But when they fired up their Merlin engines, the difference was immediate. The roar was deeper, throater. The propeller blades bit the air with more aggression. The gauges jumped higher than before. Flight Lieutenant Richard Turner, one of the early test pilots, described the first run with 150 octane as like strapping yourself to a wild horse. The Mustang leapt forward, climbed faster than it ever had, and responded like a living thing. You could feel it, he said years later. The engine wasn't just running, it was hungry. The reason was simple physics. A higher octane rating meant the fuel could withstand higher compression and boost pressure before detonating prematurely, a phenomenon pilots called knock. With 150 octane, engineers could safely crank up the manifold pressure, squeezing more power out of the Merlin engine without damaging it. At 80 inches of boost, that meant over 1,700 horsepower, an unimaginable number for a single-engine fighter just a year earlier. It wasn't long before this invisible advantage began to show results in combat. Over the skies of Germany, Luftwaffe pilots noticed something strange. The P-51s they were facing seemed faster. They climbed steeper, dove harder, and could catch German fighters that previously had no trouble outrunning them. In one after-action report, a Mustang pilot recalled chasing a Messerschmitt Bf 109G from 25,000 feet all the way down to the deck, something that was practically impossible before. He tried to dive away, but I stayed on him, the pilot wrote. He rolled left, I followed. He pushed down harder, I matched him. The only difference that day was the new fuel. Without it, I'd have lost him. By late 1944, squadrons equipped with 150 octane fuel began reporting kill ratios that shocked even Allied commanders. In some groups, Mustangs were shooting down 10 German aircraft for everyone they lost. The Luftwaffe, already battered and short on experienced pilots, couldn't keep up. But the effects of a new fuel went far beyond individual dogfights. It reshaped the entire strategy of the air war. Before 150 octane, P-51s often had to fly at reduced power to conserve fuel on long escort missions. Now, with better performance and efficient cruise settings, they could stay with bombers deeper into enemy territory, then push the throttle hard when the fight came. For bomber crews, this was salvation. The days of watching their escorts turn back halfway to Berlin were over. The Mustangs were now there from takeoff to target, and all the way home. And that, more than any bomb or bullet, broke the Luftwaffe's back. Yet the story of 150 octane wasn't entirely smooth. The new blend came with problems. It was more corrosive, required specialized seals, and pushed engines to their mechanical limits. Maintenance crews had to adjust carburetors, change spark plugs more frequently, and monitor for overheating. But the pilots didn't care. As one mechanic joked, they'll take melted pistons over missing airmen any day. Behind the scenes, the chemistry of this miracle fuel was almost as fascinating as its effect in combat. It wasn't just a matter of refining gasoline to a higher purity. The recipe for 150 octane was part science, part alchemy. To reach that rating, chemists used additives like aromatic hydrocarbons, toluene and xylene, to increase resistance to knocking. They added tetraethyl lead as an anti-detonation compound, boosting stability. Then came tryptane, a highly specialized molecule that was so effective it became almost mythical among fuel engineers. Tryptane could push engines beyond anything previously thought possible, but it was expensive and dangerous to produce, so it was reserved for elite squadrons. The result was a cocktail so potent that it could turn an ordinary fighter into a monster. And it wasn't just the Mustangs that benefited. Spitfires, Tempests, and even P-47 Thunderbolts began switching to 150 octane in late 1944. Across the board, Allied fighters gained 20 to 30 extra miles per hour at altitude. In dogfights, that meant life or death. Interestingly, the Germans tried to respond in kind. The Luftwaffe experimented with high-performance fuels of their own, such as C3, rated at about 130 octane, but production shortages and Allied bombing crippled their ability to make it at scale. Some desperate German engineers even mixed methanol and nitrous oxide to squeeze a few more minutes of power from their engines, but it was a losing race. The Americans, with their vast oil refineries and logistical superiority, could deliver barrels of 150 octane fuel across the Atlantic faster than the Germans could even refine theirs. Fuel, the most boring and overlooked of all war materials, had become a weapon all on its own. By early 1945, the skies of Europe belonged to the P-51 Mustang and its brothers. Allied bombers now reached targets deep inside Germany with devastating precision, escorted the entire way. The Luftwaffe's last aces, men who had once ruled the air, found themselves outnumbered, outclimbed, and outpaced. For the first time in the war, Germany could no longer defend its own sky. Cities burned. Factories stopped. The war machine sputtered to a halt, and it all traced back, in part, to that simple, almost invisible innovation, the day the number 150 was stamped on a fuel barrel. But the story doesn't end there, because on one particular mission, when the first full-scale combat run using 150 octane fuel took place, the results were so shocking that even Allied commanders couldn't believe the reports. It became the day the P-51 Mustang's secret weapon proved itself beyond doubt, a turning point written not in bullets, but in chemistry. It was May 1944. In the still dark hours before dawn, a low hum rolled across the English countryside as hundreds of engines coughed to life. Mechanics moved like ghosts between the rows of aircraft, flashlights flickering off gleaming metal. The air reeked of fuel, the new kind, and tension. This was the first major mission where the entire group would run on 150 octane fuel. Their target, Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany. For the bomber crews, it was another long, brutal day. But for the P-51 pilots, this was something else. A test, a gamble, a chance to see if the rumors were true, that this new super fuel could give them the power to outrun death itself. The first Mustangs rolled down the runway at dawn. Their propellers carved the mist into ribbons as they climbed into formation. The roar was different, deeper, angrier. From the ground, it sounded like thunder rolling east. The 357th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Thomas Hayes, took point. Their call sign was Yoxford Boys, but that morning, they felt like something else entirely. Predators unleashed. Hours later, at 30,000 feet, The bomber stream crossed into German airspace. Below them, the ground was invisible beneath a blanket of white cloud. Up ahead, the sky began to sparkle, tiny flashes like fireflies. Flak! The Luftwaffe was waiting. Soon, radar screens across Germany lit up with warnings. Dozens of Allied bombers, hundreds of fighters. The alarm spread. Airfields scrambled. From bases around Berlin, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs clawed into the air. The hunters were ready, but they didn't yet know they were now the hunted. The first wave of German fighters climbed hard, expecting the same slow American escort response they'd always seen. But this time, the Mustangs were already there, higher, faster, and closing in. Captain Robert Goebel, flying his P-51, the Shark, spotted the enemy first, a formation of Bf-109s banking toward the bombers. He slammed the throttle forward. The boost gauge spiked 80 inches. Normally, that would risk an engine blowout. But with 150 octane in the tank, the Merlin engine didn't stutter. It screamed. The Mustang surged ahead like a rocket. Goebel later said, "I didn't chase him. I swallowed him." In seconds, he was behind the lead German fighter, and one burst of .50 caliber fire shredded its tail. The Messerschmitt spiraled down through the clouds, trailing black smoke. Across the sky, similar duels unfolded. The Luftwaffe pilots tried their usual escape dives, but the Mustang stayed with them. In climb, in roll, in pursuit, the difference was unmistakable. The P-51s had always been formidable. But now, with the power boost from 150 octane, they had become something terrifying. By mission's end, the results were staggering. The bomber formations reached Berlin, dropped their payloads, and returned, without a single loss to enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe lost over 40 aircraft that day. Allied losses, 3 damaged, none destroyed in combat. When the debriefing reports reached command, General Jimmy Doolittle himself reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we've just changed the air war." Word spread fast. Squadrons clamored for the new fuel. Maintenance crews worked day and night to convert engines for higher boost settings. Pilots, once wary of the volatile blend, began treating it like liquid gold. It wasn't just about performance, it was confidence. For the first time, they knew they could take on the Luftwaffe on equal terms and win. Even the Germans began noticing. Captured pilots described their disbelief. One Luftwaffe ace reportedly told his interrogator, "We dive, we run, we climb, and they follow. It's as if your planes have no limits anymore." That wasn't far from the truth. By summer 1944, Allied air superiority was complete. The P-51s, armed with 150 octane fuel, now ranged freely across Europe. They strafed trains, destroyed airfields, and hunted enemy aircraft even on the ground. The once proud Luftwaffe was bleeding to death. Behind this dominance was not just better flying or tactics, but invisible innovation. Chemistry, logistics, and relentless ingenuity had given the Allies the power edge they needed. Fuel had become a strategic weapon. What few knew at the time was that the effort to produce and deliver 150 octane fuel had been enormous. Refining plants in the United States had to be modified to handle the specialized additives. Entire convoys were organized to ship the fuel safely across the Atlantic. And once in Britain, it was distributed under heavy secrecy. Only select squadrons were authorized to use it, each barrel tracked like ammunition. And yet, in the vast machinery of war, it worked. The invisible lifeblood of victory flowed, barrel by barrel, into the tanks of Mustangs, Spitfires, and Thunderbolts. As 1945 approached, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Allied bombers roamed unchallenged. Cities that once burned the night sky with searchlights now lay in ruin. And through it all, the P-51 Mustang became the symbol of dominance, the sleek, unstoppable guardian of the bomber streams. It wasn't just a plane anymore. It was the face of air supremacy. And deep within its tanks, its secret weapon burned bright. 150 octane aviation fuel, the unseen catalyst that helped end the air war. When the war finally ended, few people talked about fuel. They spoke of heroes, of missions of dogfights. But those who had been there, pilots, engineers, mechanics, knew better. They knew that victory in the air wasn't just about courage or skill. It was about science, about the quiet men in laboratories who mixed chemicals that changed history. Years later, when historians looked back at the P-51 Mustang's legacy, they often called it the plane that won the war. But the truth is subtler. The Mustang was the sword. 150 octane fuel was the sharpened edge. Together, they became unstoppable. And that's the real secret of the P-51 Mustang's triumph. It wasn't just about steel and wings. It was about what flowed inside them. A clear, golden liquid that turned ordinary pilots into legends and ordinary planes into the most feared fighters the world had ever seen. One small number, 150, etched on a fuel drum in a cold English morning, helped rewrite the story of World War II. And long after the last Mustang was grounded, that number remained a quiet reminder of how, sometimes, the smallest changes ignite the biggest victories.